Welcome to Storyflix. In this video, we will explain Back to the 90s. This movie tells the story of a boy who is magically transported back to the 90s, where he tries to fix his parents' relationship. When he has the opportunity to change the past, will he do it wisely? Let's find out in Back to the 90s. Back to the 90s begins by showing a handsome young man named Ken who is busy with his cell phone. Ken, who had just come home from school, received a chat message from his mother asking him not to go straight home because his parents would celebrate their wedding anniversary with a romantic dinner at home. However, Ken ignored his mother's request because, like in previous years, his father was more concerned with his work, so he assumed that his father would come home late and their plans were cancelled. Ken finally arrived home, and as he was about to head to his room, he heard a strange sound coming from the used goods warehouse. He then went in there to check where the strange sound was coming from. He finds an old wooden box and finds a worn-out newspaper published in 1995, which reports about a traffic accident. Ken also finds an old photo album in the box containing his parents' wedding photos. He looks surprised when he finds an old photo showing his father, Tom, when he was young with a girl whose face was not visible. The inscription on the back of the photo says "Loves Tom forever." It turned out that the strange sound that Ken heard came from an old pager, and on the backside of the pager, there was a sticker that had faded. He then took the old photo and also the pager. That night, Ken heard his parents having another big fight, in which his mother said that Tom had not been able to forget Sally. Hearing that name, Ken immediately felt surprised and thought that the girl in his father's old photo was Sally. He then confronted his father and showed him the old photo. Ken then left the house, called his friend, and asked him to come to pick him up. Because the rain suddenly fell very hard, Ken decided to take shelter in a payphone box not far from there. Not long after, the pager rang again, and there was a message on the pager asking him to call the number listed there. Ken dared to call the number using a payphone, but moments later, lightning struck and he suddenly fell unconscious. Ken just woke up when he heard a girl's voice talking to a pager operator. The girl is Sally, who intends to contact Tom, his father. Seeing Ken sitting under her, Sally felt shocked and rushed away, thinking he was a perverted man. Ken then tried to chase Sally. But he immediately realized that the environment around him seemed foreign to him. He then went to a grocery store and found out from the newspaper's latest edition that it was the year 1995. Ken, who was still confused about what had happened, decided to go to his house. When he got there, he heard two people arguing and was very surprised to find out that it was his father, Tom, and his mother, May. Meeting the younger version of his parents, Ken fainted again because he was so shocked. Ken is then brought into the house by Tom. After awakening from his stupor, he again felt surprised when he met Tom's uncle, who was still alive, even though the man had died. Ken finally realized that he had returned to the past, to the year 1995 to be precise. Therefore, he lied by saying that he ran away from home and looked for a job and a place to live. However, Tom's uncle did not believe his words and immediately kicked him out. Ken then had no other choice and immediately left from there. He walked unsteadily to a payphone booth, intending to return to the future, but realized that he had lost the pager. Tom came up to him and asked him to come with him as he sat on the roadside. Since then, Ken has lived at Tom's house and worked at Tom's uncle's record store. One day, Tom intends to do band practice at his college. Ken looks amazed because he just found out that his father is a band member. He also said he wanted to go to Tom's campus to use the internet. Tom allows it, but Ken has a hard time persuading Tom's uncle to go there because of Tom's poor performance, and he doesn't like people who walk away from their responsibilities and jobs. Tom and Ken go to college, where Ken plans to search the internet for information. However, the internet at that time was very different, so Ken didn't get any information at all. Ken then went to the library, hoping to find something. But there, he met Sally, who still recognized him and called him a pervert. Realizing Ken's presence, Sally rushes off to Tom's training ground and tells them about Ken, who she considers a pervert. Hearing this, Tom's friends then beat up Ken. But Tom immediately stopped them when he found out that the young man who was chazzing Sally was Ken and told them that Ken was a new employee at his uncle's record store and now lives at his house. Ken then explained to Tom and Sally that he wasn't a pervert and was there looking for his fallen pager around the place. Not finding the pager, Ken then chases Sally, intending to inquire about the whereabouts of the pager, which Sally might find. However, Sally said that she had found nothing. Before leaving, Sally then reminded Tom to teach her to play the guitar as he had promised her. Sally then whined when it was getting dark, and she didn't dare to go home alone. But Tom is completely insensitive to Sally's wishes and instead asks Ken to take Sally home. The next day, Tom called the pager operator to message May. But Tom, who was indecisive, kept changing his messages, leaving the pager operator confused and his uncle annoyed that he wanted to use the phone too. Tom then wrote a message that he would send to May. But after Ken read the message, he thought that the message was less convincing and not romantic. He then helps Tom write a message for May, which turns out to be a slang-like seduction, so the pager operator is confused when typing it. That night, because May did not reply his message, Tom then ventured to call May's house. But the one who picked up the phone was May's father, who was known to be fierce and firm. After finding out that Tom called her, May just hung up. A curious Ken then asks Tom if Sally is his ex-girlfriend. Tom immediately denied this and said that his relationship with Sally was more like a sibling relationship between brother and sister. The next day, Ken came to May's house and said Tom loved her. He then asked her to come to a music show at Tom's campus because Tom and his band would be performing there. May agrees to Ken's request because she still loves Tom very much and doesn't want to part with him. May actually came to see the musical Tom and his band. But she also saw Sally's presence there, where she felt jealous and decided to leave. Ken, who saw this, then scolded Sally for ruining his plan. Arriving at home, Ken asked Tom's uncle about Sally, who always tried to chase Tom, even though Sally already knew that Tom was dating May. Tom's uncle told him that Sally had lost her beloved brother and Tom offered to take care of her forever. Even though Tom already has May, he feels responsible for always taking care of Sally because he considers her his little sister. However, Sally interprets Tom's care and affection differently, and that's why Sally always tries to catch up and get Tom's love. Tom plans to teach Sally to play the guitar and asks Ken to look after the shop. However, Ken takes the initiative to teach Sally to play the guitar so that she doesn't interfere with Tom and May's relationship and doesn't keep hoping for Tom. Ken even promised to write a song for Sally as long as she was willing to not contact Tom for a while with the excuse that Tom could focus more on his band. Sally then agreed to this. The next day, Tom asks a boy to deliver a cassette to May containing songs he wrote for May. May listened to the song and loved it. But when Tom called to ask if she would be willing to come to see the band's performance, May pretended to be nonchalant, but inside she was really happy. Meanwhile, Ken and Sally become closer as they often spend time playing guitar. Ken realizes that Sally is actually a beautiful and sweet girl, even though she often nags him. Sally then gives Ken her old pager so they can communicate. Ken is very surprised to learn that Sally's old pager is the one he's been looking for. It turned out that the pager he found in his father's old stuffed storage box was Sally's pager. However, after checking the pager, it turns out that all his messages have been deleted, so he doesn't know how he will return to the future. Sally then takes Ken to a music show in the evening, where Tom and his band perform. When finished, Sally asked Ken to take a picture of her with Tom. Unaccustomed to using an old camera, Ken accidentally covered part of the camera lens so that Sally's face was not visible when the photo was printed, and that's what Ken found in his parents' old photo album. After watching the musical performance, Ken and Sally's relationship grew closer, as did Tom and May, who had made up. Ken and Sally spent more together playing guitar and going to many places until finally, the seeds of love in Ken's heart for Sally grew. One day, after teaching Sally to play the guitar, Ken is surprised by the presence of May and her parents at Tom's uncle's house. They came there to hold Tom accountable for impregnating May. When calculated from May's current gestational age, it can be ascertained that the child that May is carrying is Tom's. Instantly, Ken felt weak when May's father asked his daughter to abort the pregnancy because if it meant, then Ken would never have been born into this world. However, May does not want to abort the fetus and Tom insists that he will take responsibility and marry May. To make May and their baby still in the womb happy, Tom decides to give up his dream of becoming a famous musician and leave the band, then look for a permanent job so that his family will not experience economic difficulties. Knowing the great sacrifices made by his father for himself and his mother, Ken felt both sad and guilty until he shed tears because he had always misunderstood his father, who was always busy at work and rarely by his side. Sally then messaged Ken asking him to come to the cinema, where they then took a photo together at the photo booth. The results of their photo were in the form of a sticker, then pasted by Sally to the old pager she gave to Ken. Sally then asks Ken to take Tom to a musical competition, where she will enter the competition and sing her song. Sally said that Tom had promised to accept her as his girlfriend if she won the competition. However, when Ken was about to say that Tom would marry May, Sally instead rushed off after writing a line of numbers on Ken's palm. Seeing the number, Ken realized that it was the number that brought him to the past, so he thought he could return to the future by calling that number. Sally won the competition the next day and then asked Ken why Tom didn't come with her. Not getting any answer from Ken, Sally then goes alone to meet Tom, where she then expresses her love for Tom and collects Tom's promise that he will date her if she wins the music competition. But Tom then told Sally that all this time, he only thought of her as his sister and he would soon marry May. Hearing this, Sally felt very sad and disappointed. Ken then met her and tried to comfort her. However, Sally gets annoyed and scolds Ken, saying that Ken has never fallen in love with someone, so he will never be able to understand her feelings. But Ken then took Sally's hand and asked her to look him in the eyes, after which Sally finally realized that Ken had fallen in love with her. However, that doesn't necessarily make Sally forget about Tom and decide to leave Ken. Under the pouring rain, Ken received a message from Sally asking him to call the number listed there. Lightning struck again, and Ken fell unconscious. When Ken finally wakes up, he finds himself back in the future and meeting his parents. Ken then apologizes to his father for having misunderstood his relationship with Sally. He also thanked him for all his sacrifices for him and his mother. Tom then tells his son not to think about Sally anymore because she won't bother their family anymore. After all, Sally died in a bus accident on Tom and May's wedding day. That's why Tom keeps a newspaper published in 1995 that reported a traffic accident that killed Sally. Hearing this, Ken then felt very surprised. Ken rushed out of the house and realized that the payphone box had disappeared somewhere. He then asked a group of motorcycle taxi drivers who were not far from there. When he found out that the public telephone box had been moved to a shelter, Ken rushed there by riding one of the motorcycles belonging to a driver. Ken then tried to convince motorcycle taxi drivers to find a public telephone box previously in front of his house. After finding it, he then dials the number listed on the pager and manages to return to the past, where he then asks Tom where Sally is. After learning that Sally intends to go to her mother's house in Chiang Mai, Ken rushes there on Tom's motorbike. She didn't realize the pager had fallen, so Tom picked it up. That's why Tom has Sally's old pager that Ken eventually finds in the future. Arriving at the terminal, Ken did not find Sally's whereabouts, so he contacted the pager operator to message Sally not to take the bus. However, the terminal clerk informed him that the bus bound for Chiang Mai had already left. Ken rushed after the bus and then stopped it. But when he got on the bus, he didn't find Sally anywhere either. Apparently Sally had read a message from Ken asking her not to get on the bus and wait for him. Since Ken didn't come, Sally decided to take the next bus. On the other hand, even though he couldn't find Sally's whereabouts, Ken felt relieved that at least Sally's life could be saved. But not long after, a long horn sounded and a truck crashed into the bus. Ken instantly returns to the future, where he then wakes up to find motorcycle taxi drivers swarming around him. According to them, Ken didn't go anywhere and only fainted when he was struck by lightning. When he returned home, Ken was surprised by how intimate and affectionate his parents were, which Ken had never seen before because they usually always fought. Ken was very happy with the change. He was still looking at Sally's old pager that he still kept in the room. Ken, who was still curious, called the number listed on the pager, but it didn't connect. But when he called Sally's home number, he was relieved and happy because the one who picked up the phone was Sally and she was still alive today. The moral we can learn from this film is if we have the opportunity to go back in time to change the future, then use the opportunity wisely so that no one suffers from the changes we make.